Every war produces men the history books are comfortable calling heroes, and a much smaller number they quietly avoid calling anything at all. This is a list of 10 of those men, the ones who fought the Civil War not by the rules either side claimed to follow, but by whatever method actually worked, regardless of what it cost the people caught in front of them. Some wore blue, some wore gray, and the uniform mattered far less than what they were willing to do once they had one on. What you're about to hear isn't the version of this war that gets taught in a classroom. It's the version that got left out of it, one name at a time. And once you know why it was left out, you'll understand exactly how this country actually got to the other side of that war. William Quantrill did not fight the Union Army. He fought the idea of Kansas itself. On an August morning in 1863, he rode into Lawrence with nearly 400 men and a list of names written weeks in advance. And by the time he rode out, close to 200 men and boys were dead, most of them unarmed, some of them children shot in front of their mothers while their homes burned behind them. Quantrill never wore a uniform that meant anything to either government. He operated in the space between war and massacre, answering to no command structure and no code of conduct, and he made certain everyone in Missouri and Kansas understood there was no line he wouldn't cross to make his point. Even the Confederacy, which had once welcomed his services and issued him a captain's commission, eventually distanced itself from what Lawrence revealed about the man they had armed. Confederate officers who had once used his raids for cover began referring to him privately as an embarrassment rather than an asset, and by the time he was killed in 1865, few in the South were willing to publicly claim him as one of their own. His deadliest student learned the lesson too well and pushed it further than Quantrill ever dared. William Anderson earned the nickname Bloody Bill not for winning battles, but for what he did once the fighting was already over. At Centralia, Missouri, his men pulled unarmed Union soldiers off a passenger train, stripped them of their uniforms, and executed them one by one while Anderson stood and watched. Survivors who fled the scene later described him scalping the dead where they fell, tying the trophies to his saddle like a man collecting receipts for a debt he believed the war owed him. He carried the scalps for weeks afterward, showing them to other guerrillas as proof of what he was capable of, and used the fear that spread from Centralia to recruit even more men willing to fight outside the rules either army claimed to follow. He was 24 years old when a Union bullet finally caught up to him in a Missouri field, and even his own commanders, men who had tolerated a great deal in the name of the cause, privately admitted they felt relief rather than loss when word of his death reached them. William Tecumseh Sherman never hid what he was doing, and that is precisely what separates him from the others on this list. He did not need secrecy because he had an entire army standing behind his cruelty, and he made no attempt to disguise its purpose in letters home or in his own official reports. His march through Georgia and into the Carolinas was never framed as a battle campaign. It was a demonstration, engineered to prove that an entire civilian population could be starved, burned, and broken until surrender began to feel like relief instead of defeat. Barns were torched by the hundreds, livestock was slaughtered in open fields so nothing would remain to feed the coming winter, and railroad tracks were heated and bent around trees so thoroughly that soldiers called the twisted iron Sherman's neckties. Sherman called it making Georgia howl, and he said it without apology, without softening, because to him, mercy was the thing prolonging the war, not the thing capable of ending it. He believed civilians who supported the war effort forfeited any claim to protection from it, and he built an entire campaign around that belief, one that stripped the Confederacy of its ability to feed itself, rather than simply defeating its armies on a battlefield, a distinction that made his name feared in the South for generations after the guns fell silent. Nathan Bedford Forrest built his reputation on speed and terror in equal measure, riding circles around Union positions faster than any general could react, and earning a reputation as a man who could appear where he was least expected. But at Fort Pillow in Tennessee, that reputation curdled into something the history books still struggle to fully explain. His men overran a Union garrison that included black soldiers, and what followed was not a surrender, it was a slaughter carried out after resistance had already ended.
Witnesses described soldiers shot down after they had thrown down their weapons, some burned alive inside tents set on fire while they were still trapped within them, and others chased into the Mississippi River and shot as they tried to swim to safety. Forrest denied ever giving the order, insisting the killing happened in the chaos of battle rather than after it. The survivors who lived long enough to testify before a congressional committee told a very different story, one that trailed him for the remainder of his life and long after it, resurfacing every time his name was mentioned in the decades that followed the war, and complicating any attempt to celebrate his cavalry tactics without addressing what those same tactics enabled once restraint was removed from the equation entirely. Ulysses S. Grant is remembered as the general who won the war, and that memory conveniently skips over the method behind the victory. At Vicksburg, he did not storm the city, he strangled it, holding a siege through weeks in which civilians inside ate mules, then rats, then whatever else could still be swallowed, until Grant's own soldiers reported hearing children crying from hunger inside the streets they were bombarding day and night. He knew the siege was working precisely because the suffering was mounting, and he waited it out, rather than risk his own men in a direct assault he judged too costly. Later, during the Overland campaign, he traded staggering casualties for ground he knew would eventually be his, at Cold Harbor sending wave after wave of men directly into fire he understood they could not survive, because he had calculated, correctly, that the Union could afford to lose more men than the Confederacy ever could. That arithmetic won the war. It also revealed a man willing to spend human lives the way a treasury spends currency, without flinching at the exchange rate, understanding long before his generals did that the war would not be won by outmaneuvering Lee, but by outlasting him regardless of the cost paid to get there. Champ Ferguson never claimed to be fighting for a flag or a cause. He was fighting for a list of names carried in his head, built out of years of feuds and grudges that predated the war entirely. Operating through the mountains of Kentucky and Tennessee, he tracked down and personally executed dozens of men, some of them former friends and neighbors who had simply chosen the wrong side of a family feud dressed up as a war, and some of them wounded Union soldiers he found recovering in makeshift hospitals, dragged out and killed where they lay. He kept no uniform and answered to no officer, moving through the hills with a small band of men who trusted his judgment about who deserved to live and who did not. When the fighting finally ended, the United States government did something it did to almost no one else on either side of the conflict. It put him on trial specifically for war crimes and hanged him, because even in a war soaked in killing, what Ferguson had done crossed a line both sides quietly agreed on, a line drawn not around combat itself, but what a man does once combat has already stopped. A distinction the law was willing to punish even when it looked away from far larger death tolls elsewhere in the same war. Henry Wirz commanded the gates of Andersonville prison, and under his watch nearly 13,000 Union prisoners died from starvation, exposure, and disease inside a stockade never built to hold the fraction of the men crowded into it. The camp had no shelter beyond what prisoners could build themselves, no clean water beyond a single contaminated creek, and no medical care that came close to matching the scale of suffering inside its walls. Survivors described a commandant who could have eased that suffering with the smallest of mercies, and instead chose to enforce every regulation to its cruelest possible letter, rationing food and medicine as though scarcity itself were a weapon he controlled personally. Men who tried to escape were hunted with dogs, and if caught, punished in front of the rest of the camp as a warning, a spectacle designed to remind every prisoner watching exactly how little control they had over whether they survived the year. When the war ended, Wirz became the only Confederate officer executed specifically for war crimes, hanged in Washington while a crowd gathered to watch, a punishment reserved for exactly one man out of the thousands who had worn the same uniform he did, chosen as the single face the government could put on a suffering so widespread that no single trial could ever fully account for it.
David Hunter believed the fastest way to end a war was to make certain there was nothing left worth fighting for. In the Shenandoah Valley, his troops burned homes, barns, and entire towns to the ground, including the Virginia Military Institute, an act that shocked even some Union officers who considered the school's destruction excessive given its limited military value. Families were left with nothing but ash and cold air before winter arrived to finish what his men had started, and reports of the destruction reached Confederate command faster than any battlefield defeat could have. hardening resistance in the valley rather than breaking it as Hunter had intended. He was recalled and criticized even by officers on his own side for the scale of destruction he authorized, some calling his campaign counterproductive as well as cruel. But the strategy he pioneered did not disappear when he did. It simply moved further south to a more famous name who would carry it to its conclusion with far greater resources behind him. That name was Philip Sheridan, and what he carried out in the Shenandoah Valley became known simply as the Burning. Under direct orders to make the valley so barren that a crow flying over it would need to carry its own food to survive the journey, Sheridan's men destroyed crops, mills, barns, and livestock across 100 miles of farmland, deliberately targeting the food supply that fed soldiers and civilians without distinction between them. Entire communities that had fed the Confederate Army for years found themselves with nothing left to plant or harvest, and refugees fleeing the valley clogged roads for weeks afterward, carrying whatever they could salvage from homes that no longer existed. It was never framed as a battle. It was a calculated famine engineered with the precision of a military campaign to break a population's will faster than any bayonet charge ever could. And it worked exactly as intended, ending the valley's usefulness to the Confederate war effort for the remainder of the conflict. Benjamin Butler earned a nickname the South never forgave him for, Beast Butler, for how he governed occupied New Orleans once the city fell under his command. When the city's women publicly insulted his soldiers in the streets, spitting on them and emptying chamber pots from balconies as they passed, Butler issued an order declaring that any woman who showed contempt for Union troops would be treated as a woman plying her trade for money. A calculated threat designed to humiliate an entire city into silence and obedience rather than risk open conflict with civilians his troops could not simply arrest. He hanged a civilian for tearing down a Union flag from a hotel balcony, an execution many considered wildly disproportionate to the offense, sent political prisoners into exile without trial, and confiscated property from wealthy families accused of disloyalty, funneling some of it toward his own personal profit according to accusations that followed him for years. He ruled the city less like an occupying general and more like a man who understood that fear, applied with precision, controls a population faster than any law ever written could. Southern newspapers printed his likeness on the bottom of chamber pots so residents could insult him daily without saying a word, a small rebellion against a man they could not remove any other way, and his name became a curse word in New Orleans households for generations after the war ended, invoked by grandparents warning children about what occupation actually looked like once the fighting itself had moved elsewhere. 10 men, 2 armies, one shared understanding that terror could finish what tactics alone were never enough to accomplish. Some were hanged for what they did, tried and executed as proof that even a war without rules still had limits someone was willing to enforce. Some were celebrated and promoted for the very same instincts, their cruelty repackaged afterward as strategy or necessity, depending on which side of the war wrote the history. All of them changed the outcome of a war by proving exactly how far the human capacity for cruelty could stretch once it put on a uniform and called itself duty. And all of them left behind a version of victory that came at a cost the textbooks rarely spell out in full. What separates them from ordinary soldiers was never the violence itself. Wars produce violence by default. It was the deliberate choice to use suffering as a weapon in its own right, aimed as precisely at civilians, prisoners, and neighbors as any rifle was ever aimed at an enemy line. That choice is the part history keeps quiet about, because acknowledging it means admitting that some of the men credited with saving the country did so using methods the country would never accept from anyone wearing a uniform today.